Hi, I'm Danny. At my father's wake, my stepmother Linda thrust a tray into my hands and said, "The catering fell through, you're handling drinks." My half-brothers Kevin and Ryan smirked as I was pushed toward the kitchen like hired help. But when FBI Agent Sarah Torres approached the makeshift bar and quietly asked, "Excuse me, are you Judge Daniel Mitchell?" the entire room went silent. Their faces drained of color. They had no idea who I'd become. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain drummed against the windows of Riverside Memorial Chapel as I stepped out of my rental car that gray October morning. Portland's autumn chill cut through my simple black suit, the same one I'd worn to court just 2 days earlier when sentencing a crime boss to 25 years in federal prison. I carried nothing but a small leather briefcase and the weight of 20 years' worth of complicated feelings about coming home. Dad's funeral had been that morning, a beautiful service where hundreds of people shared stories about Dr. Robert Mitchell, the pediatrician who'd spent 40 years healing children in this community. Now the wake was in full swing, and I could already hear the murmur of voices through the chapel's heavy wooden doors. I pulled my coat tighter and reminded myself why I was here. Not for them, but for him. The moment I walked into the reception hall, I spotted my stepfamily immediately. Linda stood near the memorial display, perfectly coiffed in designer black, accepting condolences like she was hosting a charity gala, rather than mourning her husband. Her sons flanked her with the confidence of men who'd never questioned their place in the world. Kevin, now 32, and making partner at some corporate law firm, wore a suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Ryan, the younger one at 29, had inherited Linda's sharp features and sharper tongue, working in high-stakes finance where he'd learned to treat people like numbers on a spreadsheet. I approached them quietly, the way I'd learned to move through the world as a child in their house. Linda's eyes swept over me with the same dismissive glance she'd perfected when I was 12 years old, and my father had brought me to meet his new family. She took in my off-the-rack suit, my simple black tie, the absence of any flashy jewelry or status symbols. "Danny," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she wanted to sound caring but couldn't quite manage warmth. "You made it. How was the flight from wherever you're living now?" "Washington, D.C., I wanted to say. The nation's capital, where I'd spent the last 8 years building a career that had earned me recognition from the Attorney General himself. Instead, I simply said, "The flight was fine, Linda. I'm sorry for your loss." Kevin barely looked up from his phone, typing what appeared to be an urgent email. Ryan offered a perfunctory nod before returning to his conversation with some family friends about his latest investment portfolio. The message was clear. I was an afterthought, a piece of Dad's past that they tolerated but never truly accepted. "Well," Linda continued, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her dress, "I hate to ask, but we have a bit of a crisis. The catering company called this morning with some excuse about a family emergency. Their entire staff is unavailable." She gestured toward the crowd of mourners filling the reception hall. "All these people, and no one to serve them properly." Before I could respond, she was already reaching for a black apron hanging behind the small bar setup. "You've always been so helpful, Danny. So practical. Could you handle the drink service? I know it's not ideal, but family steps up when needed, right?" The apron felt heavy in my hands, weighted with 20 years of similar moments. Every family gathering where I'd been assigned to kitchen duty while Kevin and Ryan mingled with guests. Every holiday where I'd been introduced as Robert's son from his first marriage while they were simply the boys. Every achievement of mine that had been met with polite disinterest while their smallest accomplishments were celebrated with champagne toasts. I could have said no. I could have explained that I had important calls to return, cases to review, a judicial calendar that demanded my attention even on personal days. Instead, I tied the apron around my waist and walked toward the bar. Some battles aren't worth fighting, and some truths reveal themselves in their own time. The makeshift bar was set up near the back of the reception hall, close enough to the kitchen that I could move efficiently between mixing drinks and restocking supplies. As I arranged glasses and checked the ice supply, I watched the room through the lens of someone who'd spent years observing human behavior from a judge's bench. Linda held court near the memorial photos, her grief performed with just enough authenticity to seem genuine, while maintaining the social grace of a seasoned hostess. Kevin worked the room like he was networking at a conference, handing out business cards to Dad's doctor friends and making connections that might benefit his law practice. Ryan stood with a group of younger mourners, regaling them with stories about his latest business deal. And then there was the crowd of people who'd actually loved my father. Nurses from the children's hospital where he'd volunteered for decades. Parents whose kids he'd treated through midnight emergencies and chronic illnesses. Teachers from the elementary schools where he'd provided free health screenings. These were the people who remembered him not as Linda's husband or Kevin and Ryan's stepfather, but as Dr. Mitchell, the man who'd once driven through a blizzard to check on a sick child, because the family couldn't afford an emergency room visit. I served drinks to all of them, moving through the crowd with the invisibility I'd perfected as a child. A scotch for the hospital administrator who'd worked with Dad for 30 years. Wine for the kindergarten teacher who still sent him holiday cards. Coffee for the elderly couple whose grandson Dad had helped through leukemia treatments. Each person thanked me politely, assuming I was hired help rather than family. That's when Agent Sarah Torres walked in. I noticed her immediately, because after 8 years on the federal bench, you develop an eye for law enforcement.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
She carried herself with the controlled alertness of someone always ready for trouble, her dark suit professional but practical, her movements efficient and purposeful. She scanned the room the way agents do, cataloging exits and assessing potential threats, even at a peaceful gathering like this. She made her way through the crowd, offering brief condolences to Linda and the boys before moving toward the bar, where I was mixing a martini for one of Dad's golf partners. When she approached, her expression was respectful but serious. "Excuse me," she said quietly, her voice low enough that only I could hear over the general murmur of conversation. "Are you Judge Daniel Mitchell?" The question hung in the air like a held breath. I set down the cocktail shaker, suddenly aware that several conversations around us had paused. Kevin, who'd been describing his latest corporate merger to anyone within earshot, went quiet mid-sentence. Ryan's laugh died in his throat. Linda's perfectly practiced smile faltered as she turned toward the bar. "Yes," I said simply, untying the apron and setting it aside. Though I wasn't expecting to be recognized here. Agent Torres' relief was immediate and obvious. "Your Honor, I apologize for approaching you at such a personal time. I'm Agent Sarah Torres, FBI Organized Crime Division. There's an urgent matter regarding the Castellano case you're overseeing. The defendant's legal team filed an emergency motion, claiming judicial misconduct, and we need your immediate review." The word honor seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet space around us. Linda's mouth opened slightly, her carefully maintained composure cracking for the first time all day. Kevin's phone slipped in his hands, nearly falling to the floor. Ryan stared like he was seeing me for the first time in his life.
"Judge?"
Kevin's voice cracked slightly on the word.
"Yanni, you're a judge."
Agent Torres looked genuinely confused by their shock. "Federal judge, actually. Judge Mitchell presides over some of the most significant organized crime cases on the East Coast. The Castellano prosecution has been front-page news for months." I could see the mental calculations happening behind Linda's eyes, the rapid recalibration of 20 years' worth of assumptions. Here was her stepson, the quiet one who'd always seemed content to fade into the background, being addressed with the deference reserved for one of the most powerful positions in the American justice system. "I don't understand," Linda said, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "Danny works for the government, but he never said." "I did say," I replied calmly, accepting the briefcase Agent Torres handed me. "Multiple times, actually. At Kevin's law school graduation party, I mentioned I was a federal prosecutor. At Ryan's wedding, I explained I'd been nominated for the federal bench. Last Christmas, when you asked about my job, I said I was presiding over major criminal cases." The silence that followed was deafening. I could see the memories reshaping themselves in real time on their faces. All those conversations where they'd nodded politely, while I tried to share my accomplishments, then immediately changed the subject to Kevin's latest case, or Ryan's newest investment. All those family dinners where my career updates were met with the kind of distracted attention you'd give to background noise. "You said you worked in the justice system," Linda said weakly. You thought I was a paralegal." I finished for her. "Or maybe a court clerk. Something appropriate for Robert's quiet son who never seemed to amount to much." Agent Torres cleared her throat diplomatically.
"Your Honor."
"I hate to interrupt, but the motion requires immediate attention. The defense is claiming you have a conflict of interest because your father once treated the defendant's nephew for pneumonia 15 years ago. I almost smiled at the absurdity of it. In federal court, defense attorneys threw everything at the wall, hoping something would stick. A pediatrician, treating a sick child, hardly constituted grounds for judicial recusal, but the motion required a formal response nonetheless. Of course, I said, opening the briefcase to review the documents. Agent Torres, please tell the prosecution team I'll have a written response within 2 hours. The defense motion is frivolous, but we'll address it properly through proper channels. As I spoke, I was aware of the growing circle of people listening to our conversation. Dad's colleagues, Linda's friends, even some of the catering staff had stopped what they were doing to witness this unexpected revelation. The man they'd just watched, serving drinks and clearing tables, was calmly discussing federal criminal proceedings with an FBI agent. Kevin found his voice first. Danny, I had no idea you were, federal judge is impressive. I suggested. Important, the kind of achievement that might warrant a congratulations card or a phone call. I kept my tone conversational, but the words carried weight. It's fine, Kevin. I stopped expecting recognition from this family a long time ago. Ryan stepped forward, his business school confidence clearly shaken. But why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you correct us when we...
When you what?
I asked, when you introduced me as just Danny at family events. When you assumed I couldn't afford to contribute to Dad's birthday gifts because I had a government job. When you explained to your friends that I was the family underachiever who never quite lived up to Dad's success. The truth hung between us like smoke, impossible to ignore or wave away. For 20 years, they'd seen exactly what they'd wanted to see. A convenient figure to fill the role of lesser sibling. Someone whose modest achievements made their own successes seem more impressive by comparison. Linda's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the flush creeping up her neck. Danny, we never meant to.
You never meant to notice,
I said quietly. There's a difference. Agent Torres, professional to the core, waited patiently while family drama unfolded around the federal business that had brought her here. But I could see the wheels turning behind her eyes. She was an experienced investigator, someone trained to read people and situations. The dynamics she was witnessing probably told her more about my family than 20 years of Christmas cards ever could. Your Honor, she said, diplomatically, perhaps we could discuss the case details in a more private setting. I understand this is a difficult day for your family. My family is fine, I said, glancing around the room, where Dad's real legacy lived in the nurses who'd worked beside him, the parents whose children he'd saved, the community he'd served with genuine love and dedication. Agent Torres, there's a small office off the main hallway. We can handle the Castellano matter there. As I walked away from the bar, briefcase in hand, I heard the explosion of whispered conversations behind me. 20 years of carefully maintained assumptions were crumbling in real time, and I could almost feel the seismic shift in how they'd have to see me from now on. But the most satisfying part wasn't their shock or embarrassment. It was the memory of Dad's face 2 years ago, when I'd called to tell him about my judicial nomination. He'd cried on the phone, telling me how proud he was, how he'd always known I'd accomplished something extraordinary. He'd flown to Washington for my swearing-in ceremony, sitting in the front row, with tears streaming down his face, as I took the oath to uphold justice and defend the Constitution. Linda hadn't come. She'd had a real estate conference that weekend. Kevin was busy with a case. Ryan had a golf tournament. But Dad was there, and his pride was enough to fill the entire courtroom. Now, as I prepared to review federal case documents in a funeral home office, while my step-family processed the reality of who I'd become, I realized something important. I'd stopped needing their recognition years ago. The work itself, the justice served, the criminals taken off the streets, that was what mattered. Everything else was just noise. Agent Torres followed me toward the office, her expression respectful but curious. Your Honor, I hope I didn't cause any family difficulties by addressing you formally. Agent Torres, I said, pausing at the office door, you did exactly what you should have done. Sometimes the truth has a way of revealing itself, whether people are ready for it or not. Behind us, I could hear Linda's voice rising, as she tried to explain to the gathered mourners why they'd just witnessed a federal judge serving drinks at his own father's wake. But I didn't turn around. Some conversations aren't worth having, and some people have to live with the choices they've made. The Castellano case needed my attention, and justice, unlike family recognition, couldn't wait. The office Agent Torres, and I retreated to smelled of old leather and fresh flowers, a small sanctuary tucked behind the main reception hall, where funeral directors typically met with grieving families to discuss arrangements. As I spread the Castellano case documents across the mahogany desk, I found myself thinking about the last time I'd been in a room like this. It was 12 years ago, when I'd helped Dad choose a cemetery plot for my mother, his first wife, whose remains he wanted moved closer to where he planned to be buried. Linda had called it unnecessary sentimentality and refused to participate in the discussion. Agent Torres waited patiently as I reviewed the defense motion, her professional demeanor unchanged despite the family drama she'd just witnessed. The motion itself was exactly what I'd expected, a desperate Hail Mary from a defense team watching their client face life in prison. They were claiming that my father's treatment of the defendant's nephew 15 years ago created a conflict of interest, as if a pediatrician treating pneumonia in a 6-year-old somehow compromised my ability to oversee a racketeering trial involving the child's uncle. "This is frivolous," I said, setting the documents aside. Dr. Castellano's nephew was treated by my father for pneumonia when the child was 6 years old. My father was a pediatrician who treated thousands of children over 4 decades. If treating someone's relative disqualified judges from hearing cases, half the federal bench would be recused from half their dockets. Agent Torres nodded. "That's what we figured, but the defense is trying to buy time. Word is they're hoping for a plea deal, but the prosecution team isn't interested in negotiating." "They shouldn't be," I replied firmly. "The evidence is overwhelming. 3 years of wiretaps, financial records showing money laundering through 17 shell companies, and testimony from 4 cooperating witnesses." Dr. Castellano ran a prescription drug ring that flooded the streets with opioids while using his medical license as cover. The harm he caused to communities across 3 states is incalculable. I drafted a brief response on my phone, formally denying the motion and scheduling a hearing for the following Monday to address any additional concerns the defense might raise. The legal work felt familiar and grounding, a reminder of who I'd become beyond the narrow confines of my step-family's perception. "Agent Torres," I said, handing her a copy of my response, "please forward this to both legal teams and ensure it's filed with the court clerk by tomorrow morning. I'll be back in Washington Sunday evening." "Of course, Your Honor." She paused, glancing toward the door, where we could still hear the murmur of conversations from the reception hall. "I hope I didn't create any awkwardness with your family. I had no idea they weren't aware of your position." I almost laughed at the understatement. "Agent Torres, my family has spent 20 years perfecting the art of not seeing what they don't want to acknowledge. Today was simply the day that became impossible to maintain." As we prepared to return to the reception, Agent Torres' radio crackled with a message from her field office. She stepped away to take the call, leaving me alone with the case files and my thoughts. Through the thin walls, I could hear Linda's voice, higher pitched than usual, explaining to someone that she'd always known I was involved in important government work, but had never realized just how important. The selective memory was impressive, even by Linda's standards. Just 6 months ago, at Ryan's engagement party, she'd introduced me to her friends as Robert's son, who works for the courts in Washington. When one of them had asked what kind of work, she'd waved her hand dismissively and said, "Oh, you know, government paperwork. Very bureaucratic." I'd been standing right next to her when she said it, wearing the same patient smile I'd learned to wear at family gatherings. That night, I'd gone back to my hotel room and called Judge Patricia Hartwell, my mentor and the woman who'd first encouraged me to pursue a federal judgeship. Patricia had listened to my frustration with the understanding of someone who'd faced her own share of family dynamics that couldn't accommodate her success. "Danny," she'd said, in her characteristic direct way, "you can't make people see what they're determined not to notice, but you can decide whether their blindness defines your worth." Those words had stayed with me through the confirmation process, through the media attention that came with being the youngest federal judge appointed in Oregon's history, through the high-profile cases that had made my name recognizable to anyone who followed federal criminal justice. My step-family's inability to acknowledge my achievements had become background noise, as irrelevant to my actual life as weather reports from cities I'd never visit. Agent Torres finished her call and returned to where I was gathering the case documents. "Your Honor, I hate to add to an already complicated day. There's been a development in the Castellano case. We've just arrested 2 additional suspects based on information from the wiretaps. The defense team is likely to file another motion, claiming prosecutorial misconduct. Let them file whatever they want. I said, closing my briefcase. The evidence was obtained through proper warrants, the wiretaps were court-authorized, and every procedure was followed to the letter. Their client is guilty, and no amount of procedural theater is going to change that. We walked back toward the reception hall, where the crowd had thinned slightly as afternoon turned toward evening. Linda was holding court near the memorial display, surrounded by a group of women I recognized as her book club friends. From the animated way she was gesturing, I could tell she was regaling them with the story of my unexpected revelation. Kevin and Ryan stood near the bar, where I'd been working earlier, both of them on their phones. Even from across the room, I could see the tension in their postures, the way they kept glancing in my direction, while they spoke in urgent whispers, to whoever was on the other end of their calls. Dr. Michael Barnes, Dad's longtime colleague, and one of the few people in the room who'd known about my judicial appointment, approached me with a gentle smile. Michael had attended my swearing-in ceremony, flying to Washington at his own expense, because he'd wanted to witness what he called Robert's greatest pride. "Danny," he said warmly, "I have to say, watching Linda's face when that FBI agent called you Your Honor was worth the price of admission. I don't think I've ever seen someone's worldview collapse so completely in real time." "Dr. Barnes," I replied, "I suspect Linda's worldview has been carefully constructed to exclude information that doesn't fit her preferred narrative. Today just made that impossible to maintain." Michael chuckled, but his expression grew serious. "Your father talked about you constantly, you know. Every medical conference, every hospital meeting, every golf game, he found a way to work in a story about his son, the federal judge. He was so proud he could barely contain himself." The words hit harder than I'd expected, creating a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with the day's revelations, and everything to do with the man we were here to honor. Dad had understood what I'd accomplished, had celebrated it privately even when his wife and stepchildren couldn't be bothered to acknowledge it publicly. "He never said anything to them," I said, not quite making it a question. "Oh, he tried," Michael replied sadly. "Christmas dinner 2 years ago, he started telling the story of your confirmation hearing." Linda changed the subject to Kevin's promotion before he got halfway through. "Last Thanksgiving, he brought up the organized crime case that made the front page of the Washington Post." Ryan interrupted to talk about his latest stock picks. I watched Linda across the room, still performing her role as the surprised but supportive stepmother who'd always recognized my potential. The cognitive dissonance was remarkable, her ability to rewrite history in real time, to transform 20 years of dismissal into a narrative of quiet pride and understanding. Agent Torres approached us, ready to leave but clearly reluctant to interrupt what appeared to be an important conversation. "Your Honor, I'll file the response first thing tomorrow morning. If anything urgent develops over the weekend, I'll contact you through the usual channels." "Thank you, Agent Torres, and please extend my appreciation to the prosecution team for their diligence in this matter." As the FBI agent made her way toward the exit, I noticed the ripple effect her departure created. Conversations paused, as people watched her leave, their eyes following her professional stride, before turning back to me with new curiosity. Word had spread through the reception about the federal judge, who'd been serving drinks, and I could feel the weight of their reassessment. Dr. Barnes excused himself to speak with other colleagues, leaving me alone near the memorial display, where dozens of photos chronicled Dad's life. There were pictures from medical school, early photos of him with my mother, images from his pediatric practice, and scattered throughout, photos of family gatherings and celebrations. I studied them carefully, looking for my own face in the visual record of Dad's life. There I was at age 8, gap-toothed and grinning at his medical school reunion. At 12, awkward and uncertain, standing slightly apart from Linda and her boys at their first Christmas together. At 16, in a cap and gown at high school graduation, Dad's arm around my shoulders, while Linda checked her watch in the background. But after that, the photos told a different story. College graduation pictures that included only Dad and me. Law school ceremonies where I stood alone, except for Dad's proud presence in the audience. My swearing in as a federal prosecutor, again just Dad and me, both of us beaming in the formal photos taken in his office afterward. The visual narrative was clear. At some point, the family photos had split into 2 parallel collections. The official Mitchell family memories featuring Linda, Kevin and Ryan, and the private father-son moments that Dad had treasured, but never felt comfortable displaying prominently. Kevin approached me hesitantly, his corporate confidence clearly shaken by the afternoon's revelations. His expensive suit looked rumpled now, his usually perfect hair disheveled from running his hands through it. Danny, he began, his voice uncertain in a way I'd never heard before. I've been thinking about what happened earlier, and I want you to know that I never meant to. To what, Kevin? I asked, genuinely curious about how he'd complete that sentence. To dismiss your work, to not take it seriously. He glanced around nervously, as if worried about who might overhear our conversation. I honestly didn't know you were a federal judge. When you said you worked in the justice system, I guess I just assumed. You assumed I was a clerk, or a paralegal, or maybe a probation officer. I finished for him, something appropriately modest for the stepbrother, who never seemed to measure up to your standards. Kevin's face flushed red. That's not fair. We never said you didn't measure up. You didn't have to say it, Kevin. You just had to live it. I gestured toward the memorial photos surrounding us. Every family gathering, where my career updates were met with polite disinterest, while your latest case or Ryan's newest deal was celebrated with champagne toasts. Every Christmas where my contributions to conversation were overlooked, while you two held court about your achievements. But you never corrected us, Kevin protested weakly. You never explained how important your job really was. The irony was almost overwhelming. Kevin, I told you 3 years ago that I was presiding over the largest organized crime prosecution in federal court history. Your response was to ask if I'd seen the latest episode of some legal drama on television, because you thought I might enjoy it. I could see the memory registering on his face, the uncomfortable recognition of a conversation he'd forgotten, because it hadn't fit his understanding of who I was supposed to be in his narrative. Ryan joined us, having finished his phone calls, his usual swagger replaced
by an uncertainty that made him look younger than his 29 years. Danny, I just got off the phone with my boss. He wants to know if you're the Judge Mitchell who's been featured in Forbes and the Wall Street Journal for your work on financial crimes cases. That would be me, I said simply. Jesus, Ryan breathed. I had no idea. I mean, we always knew you were smart, but federal judge? That's… He trailed off, apparently unable to find words for what that was. It's what happens when someone takes their education seriously, works 18-hour days for 20 years, and doesn't give up when the people around them fail to notice their achievements, I said without malice, stating facts rather than making accusations. Linda appeared beside her sons, her earlier composure replaced by an anxious energy that made her movements quick and nervous. Danny, I've been telling everyone how proud we've always been of your accomplishments. I hope you know that we've always supported your career, even if we didn't always understand the details. The revision of history was breathtaking in its audacity. I looked at this woman who'd spent 2 decades treating me like an afterthought, who'd introduced me to her friends as Robert's son from his first marriage in a tone that suggested I was an unfortunate obligation rather than a family member. Linda, I said calmly, 6 months ago at Ryan's engagement party, you told your book club that I had a little government job pushing papers around. When Mrs. Henderson asked if I was a lawyer, you said, oh no, nothing that impressive, just bureaucratic work. The memory hit her like a physical blow, her carefully maintained facade cracking as she realized I'd heard every dismissive word. I didn't mean, you meant exactly what you said, I interrupted gently. You meant that in your understanding of the world, I was the family member whose achievements didn't warrant attention or celebration, and that's fine, Linda. People see what they want to see. Dr. Barnes returned to our group, carrying 2 cups of coffee and offering one to me with a knowing smile. I couldn't help but overhear, he said, addressing Linda directly. You know, your husband used to carry copies of Danny's confirmation hearing coverage in his wallet. He'd show them to anyone who'd stand still long enough to look. My son, the federal judge, he'd say. Youngest one in Oregon history. Linda's face went pale, the implications of Dr. Barnes's words sinking in slowly. Dad had been proud enough to carry newspaper clippings in his wallet, but she'd never thought to ask to see them. He'd tried to share his pride in my accomplishments, but she'd been too focused on her own son's achievements to pay attention. He never showed me any newspaper articles, she said weakly. That's because you never asked, Dr. Barnes replied with the gentle directness of someone who'd known the family dynamics for years. Robert tried to share Danny's successes with you, but you always seemed more interested in discussing Kevin's cases or Ryan's business deals. The silence that followed was deafening. Around us, the reception continued, but our small group existed in a bubble of uncomfortable truth that 20 years of careful avoidance couldn't contain anymore. I finished my coffee and set the cup on a nearby table, ready to bring this conversation to its natural conclusion. I need to head back to my hotel, I said. I have a flight to Washington tomorrow morning, and there are several cases that require my attention before court on Monday.
Wait, Linda said urgently, reaching out as if to physically stop me from leaving. We should talk more, as a family. There's obviously been some miscommunication over the years, and we should clear the air. I looked at her carefully, this woman who'd spent 20 years failing to see me clearly, now suddenly eager to build a relationship based on the professional recognition she'd finally been forced to acknowledge. Linda, I said quietly, there's been no miscommunication. You've seen exactly what you wanted to see, and I've learned to live with that. The only thing that's changed today is that your selective vision became impossible to maintain. I turned to Kevin and Ryan, who were watching this exchange with the fascination of people witnessing a car accident in slow motion. I wish you both well in your careers. I hope you find the success and recognition that you've always taken for granted. As I walked toward the exit, Dr. Barnes fell into step beside me. Danny, he said quietly, your father would be proud of how you handled that. He always said you had more dignity in your little finger than most people manage in their entire lives. Barnes, I replied, Dad taught me that worth isn't determined by other people's recognition. I've been living by that principle for years. Today just made it public. We reached the door of the reception hall, where Agent Torres' business card was still tucked into my jacket pocket, a tangible reminder of the life I'd built far from the narrow expectations of my step-family. Tomorrow I'd return to Washington to cases that mattered and colleagues who understood the weight of the work we did together. Behind us I could hear Linda's voice rising as she tried to explain to the remaining mourners why they'd witnessed such an unusual family dynamic. But I didn't turn around to listen. Some conversations aren't worth having, and some people have to live with the consequences of their choices. The rain had stopped, leaving the Portland streets gleaming under the streetlights as I walked toward my rental car. In 12 hours, I'd be back in my chambers, reviewing briefs and preparing for oral arguments that would determine whether dangerous criminals spent the rest of their lives in prison or found ways to continue harming innocent people. It was important work, meaningful work, and it had never depended on my stepfamily's ability to understand or acknowledge it. Today had simply made that independence impossible for them to ignore. The Portland Marriott felt like a sanctuary after the emotional minefield of the wake. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, still wearing my funeral suit, staring at my phone as missed calls and text messages accumulated like digital snow. Word traveled fast in legal circles, and apparently someone at the wake had shared the story of the federal judge who'd been serving drinks at his father's funeral before being recognized by the FBI. The first message was from Judge Patricia Hartwell, my longtime mentor who'd guided me through the federal appointment process. Danny, heard about today through the grapevine. Call me when you're ready to talk. Some families take longer to catch up to reality than others. Proud of how you handled yourself. Patricia had a gift for cutting through emotional complexity with surgical precision, a skill that had served her well during 30 years on the federal bench. The second was from Jessica Park, the chief prosecutor on the Castellano case. Judge Mitchell, Agent Torres briefed us on today's events. Hope your family's situation improves. The defense filed 3 more motions this evening, all equally frivolous. We'll have responses ready for Monday's hearing. Jessica was relentless in her pursuit of justice, the kind of prosecutor who viewed every criminal case as a personal mission to protect society from predators. But it was the third message that stopped me cold. It was from Linda, sent just 20 minutes after I'd left the reception. Danny, I know today was difficult for everyone. I think there are things we need to discuss as a family. Could we meet for breakfast tomorrow before your flight? I realize we may have misunderstood some things over the years. I set the phone aside without responding. After 20 years of being systematically overlooked, Linda wanted a breakfast meeting to discuss things as a family. The timing was remarkable, her sudden interest in family communication coinciding exactly with her discovery that I held one of the most powerful positions in the American justice system. My laptop chimed with an encrypted email from my judicial assistant in Washington. Judge Mitchell, the Castellano defense team has requested an emergency conference call for tomorrow morning. They're claiming new evidence that allegedly proves prosecutorial misconduct. Should I schedule the call for your usual Sunday availability? I typed back quickly, schedule it for 8 a.m. Pacific. I'll be flying back tomorrow afternoon, but this needs to be addressed immediately. Also, please pull the complete case file for my review. I suspect they're fishing for procedural errors that don't exist. The legal work grounded me, reminding me of the life I'd built beyond the complicated dynamics of family expectations. For 8 years, I'd presided over cases that shaped federal criminal law, sent organized crime leaders to prison, and protected communities from the kind of predators who used legitimate businesses as cover for devastating criminal enterprises. My colleagues respected my judgment, my decisions were cited in legal journals, and my courtroom was known for its fairness and efficiency. None of that had required Linda's approval or Kevin and Ryan's acknowledgement. I'd built my career one case at a time, one decision at a time, earning recognition through competence rather than family connections. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Kevin, his message longer and more urgent than his mother's diplomatic approach. "Danny, I've been doing some research since this afternoon. Your name comes up in major legal publications all the time. The Hartwell crime syndicate case, the Morrison financial fraud prosecution, the Henderson drug trafficking ring. You've been involved in some of the biggest federal cases of the last decade." I had no idea. I feel like an idiot for not knowing. "Can we talk?" The research phase had begun. Kevin, with his corporate lawyer's instincts, was probably spending his evening Google searching my name and discovering the professional reputation I'd never bothered to explain to them. Ryan was likely doing the same thing, his finance background helping him understand the significance of the financial crime cases I'd overseen. They were learning about my career the same way strangers would, through public records and media coverage rather than family conversations. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd stopped trying to share my professional achievements with them years ago, after enough polite disinterest had made it clear they weren't actually listening. Another message appeared, this one from Ryan. "Danny, just saw the Forbes article about you from last year. Federal judge leading the fight against organized crime. Why didn't you ever tell us about any of this stuff? I mean, really tell us." Mom's freaking out. She keeps saying she didn't know, but I'm starting to think we weren't paying attention. At least Ryan was honest about their failure to listen. For years I'd offered details about my work during family gatherings, only to watch their eyes glaze over as they waited for their turn to discuss their own careers. They'd perfected the art of polite non-engagement, nodding at appropriate intervals, while clearly thinking about other things. I remembered Ryan's wedding 3 years ago, when I'd tried to explain why I couldn't stay for the extended weekend celebration. "I'm in the middle of a major racketeering trial," I'd said. "Closing arguments are Monday, and I need to review jury instructions over the weekend." Linda had patted my arm sympathetically and said, "Oh, Danny's always so busy with his paperwork. That's what government jobs are like. Paperwork." She'd reduced a federal criminal trial involving organized crime, money laundering and human trafficking to paperwork. My phone rang, interrupting my trip down memory lane. The caller ID showed Dr. Michael Barnes, Dad's colleague who'd witnessed the afternoon's revelations with the satisfaction of someone who'd been waiting years for the truth to surface. "Danny," his voice was warm but concerned, "I wanted to check on you after today's excitement. I imagine it was emotionally exhausting to watch your family discover what the rest of us have known for years." "Dr. Barnes, I appreciate your concern, but I'm fine. Honestly, I stopped needing their recognition a long time ago. Today was just the day their selective blindness became impossible to maintain." "Your father worried about that dynamic," Dr. Barnes said carefully. "He used to ask me if he should intervene more directly, force them to pay attention to your achievements. I always told him that real recognition can't be forced, and meaningful relationships can't be built on obligation." "You gave him good advice," I replied. Dad understood what I'd accomplished. His pride was enough. He kept a file, you know, Dr. Barnes continued. Every newspaper article, every legal journal mention, every professional recognition you received. He called it his Danny folder, and brought it to medical conferences to show his colleagues. He was so proud he couldn't contain himself. The image of Dad carrying around a folder of my achievements, sharing them with his medical colleagues while his wife remained oblivious to their existence, created a bittersweet ache in my chest. He'd celebrated my success in the spaces where he felt safe to do so, even if he couldn't make it visible in his own home. Dr. Barnes, did he ever talk about why he didn't push back more when Linda and the boys dismissed my career? There was a long pause before he answered. "Your father was a brilliant doctor and a kind man, but he wasn't comfortable with confrontation. I think he hoped that eventually they'd notice on their own, that love would make them curious enough to really see you." "That's a generous interpretation," I said. The less generous version is that he prioritized peace in his marriage over advocacy for his son. "Maybe both things can be true," Dr. Barnes suggested gently. "People are complicated, Danny. Your father's love for you was genuine, even if his courage failed him sometimes. After we ended the call, I found myself thinking about the complexity of family relationships, the way love and disappointment could coexist in the same space for decades. Dad had been proud of me privately, while failing to defend me publicly. Linda had dismissed my achievements while claiming to care about my well-being. Kevin and Ryan had ignored my career while assuming we had a functional sibling relationship. Everyone had been operating from their own understanding of reality, carefully curated to avoid uncomfortable truths or challenging conversations. Today had shattered those carefully maintained illusions, forcing them to confront the gap between their assumptions and the actual facts of my life. My laptop chimed again with another encrypted email, this one from the Supreme Court clerk's office. Judge Mitchell, Justice Williams would like to schedule a preliminary discussion regarding the Morrison appeal that's likely to reach our docket next term. Are you available for a conference call next week? I stared at the message for a long moment, absorbing its significance. The Supreme Court didn't request preliminary discussions with lower court judges, unless the case involved novel legal principles or constitutional questions of national importance. The Morrison case, a complex financial fraud prosecution involving offshore banking and cryptocurrency, was apparently heading to the highest court in the land. This was the kind of professional recognition that actually mattered. The Supreme Court valued my judgment enough to seek my input on a case that would likely set precedent for federal financial crime prosecutions for decades to come. My legal reasoning would be studied by law students, cited by other judges, and incorporated into the foundation of American jurisprudence. But as I typed my response confirming availability for the Supreme Court conference, I realized something profound had shifted in my thinking today. For years I'd carried a small, carefully hidden hope that someday my step-family would recognize my achievements and feel genuine pride in my success. I'd imagined moments when they might brag about their federal judge stepbrother, when they might seek my advice on legal matters, when they might see me as more than just a quiet presence at family gatherings. Today had shown me that their recognition, when it finally came, felt hollow and opportunistic. Linda's sudden interest in family communication, Kevin's research-driven apologies, Ryan's amazed discovery of my public profile. None of it carried the weight of genuine understanding or authentic relationship. The people who truly mattered, my judicial colleagues, the prosecutors and defense attorneys who practiced in my courtroom, the Supreme Court justices who valued my legal reasoning, had never needed to discover my worth. They'd recognized it from the beginning, and built professional relationships, based on mutual respect and shared commitment to justice. My phone buzzed with yet another message, this one from a number I didn't recognize. Judge Mitchell, this is Karen Williams from Channel 8 News. We heard about the interesting situation at your father's wake today, and would love to interview you about the experience of being underestimated by family. Could we schedule something tomorrow? The media attention was beginning, which meant the story had spread beyond the funeral home and into the broader Portland community. By tomorrow, the tale of the federal judge who served drinks at his father's wake would probably be making rounds on social media, complete with commentary about family dynamics and professional recognition. I deleted the message without responding. Some stories didn't need to be told to strangers, and some family dysfunction didn't require public analysis. Instead, I opened my case files and spent the next 3 hours reviewing briefs for Monday's hearings. The Castellano case required final preparation, the Henderson drug trafficking appeal needed attention, and 2 new criminal cases were scheduled for preliminary conferences. This was work that mattered, work that protected communities, and upheld the rule of law. As I read through witness testimony and legal precedents, I felt the day's emotional turbulence, settling into something more familiar and manageable. The law was logical, predictable, fair. Criminal defendants received due process. Prosecutors presented evidence, judges applied established legal principles, and justice emerged from the careful balance of competing interests. It was so much cleaner than family dynamics, where love and disappointment twisted together in patterns that could persist for decades without resolution. In my courtroom, truth was established through evidence and argument. In family relationships, truth seemed to be whatever people needed it to be to maintain their preferred version of reality. Around midnight, as I was closing the last case file, my phone rang one final time. The caller ID showed Linda's number, but I let it go to voicemail. Whatever she wanted to discuss could wait until I was ready to hear it, if that day ever came. The voicemail notification appeared a minute later, and despite my better judgment, I found myself curious enough to listen.
Danny, Linda's voice was different than I'd ever heard it. Smaller, less confident, almost vulnerable. I know you're probably not interested in talking to me right now, and I understand why. I've been thinking about today, about things that were said, and I'm starting to realize how badly I've misunderstood your life. There was a long pause, the sound of Linda gathering courage for whatever came next. I found your father's office tonight. He kept a filing cabinet I never bothered to look through before. There's a whole drawer labeled Danny, filled with newspaper articles, and legal journal copies and photographs from ceremonies I never attended. There are letters from other judges praising your work, commendations from the Attorney General's office, even a personal note from a Supreme Court justice. Another pause, longer this time. I don't know how I missed all of this. I don't know how I convinced myself that your quiet demeanor meant you weren't accomplishing anything significant. I think I was so focused on Kevin and Ryan's more obvious successes that I didn't bother to understand what your kind of success looked like. Her voice cracked slightly on the next words. Your father tried to show me these things over the years. I remember him bringing up your cases, your appointments, your recognition. I thought he was just being a proud parent, exaggerating the importance of routine government work. I never asked questions. I never paid attention. I just smiled and changed the subject to something I understood better. The voicemail continued for another 2 minutes, Linda's voice growing more emotional, as she described her evening of discovery, her growing understanding of how completely she'd misjudged my life and career. She ended with a request for forgiveness, and another invitation to breakfast, this one sounding less like obligation, and more like genuine regret. I saved the voicemail but didn't return the call. Apologies were important, but they didn't erase 20 years of systematic dismissal. Understanding the depth of her misperception was useful, but it didn't create the foundation for a meaningful relationship going forward. Some damage couldn't be undone with late-night realizations and tearful voicemails. Some relationships were too broken to repair, no matter how sincere the regret or how complete the recognition of past mistakes. I turned off my phone, closed my laptop, and prepared for sleep. Tomorrow I'd fly back to Washington, back to work that mattered, and colleagues who'd never needed to discover my worth, because they'd recognized it from the beginning. The rain had started again outside my hotel window, Portland's autumn weather providing a gentle soundtrack for the end of a day that had changed everything and nothing at the same time. My step-family finally knew who I was, but I'd been that person all along. Their recognition didn't make me more important, and their previous dismissal hadn't made me less significant. I was Judge Daniel Mitchell, Federal Criminal Court, and that truth had never depended on their ability to see it. The Sunday morning flight from Portland to Washington felt different than the red-eye journey I'd taken just 3 days earlier. As the plane climbed above the Pacific Northwest's familiar cloud cover, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed in such a short time, and more importantly, how much had remained exactly the same. My phone had been silent since I'd turned it back on at 6 a.m. No more late-night voicemails from Linda, no research-driven apologies from Kevin and Ryan, no urgent messages from reporters wanting to discuss family dynamics. The media attention had apparently been brief, a local curiosity story that burned bright for a day before being replaced by more pressing news cycles. But the legal world had taken notice in ways that mattered more. During my layover in Denver, I'd received 3 separate messages from judicial colleagues who'd heard various versions of the story through the federal court network. Judge Patricia Hartwell had sent a characteristically direct text, "Heard about your family's sudden discovery of your identity. Hope you reminded them that ignorance isn't an excuse in law or life." Judge Samuel Rodriguez from the Southern District of California had been more philosophical. "Danny, sometimes the people closest to us are the last ones to see clearly. Don't let their delayed recognition diminish what you've built independently." And from Judge Maria Santos in New York, a simple but powerful message: "Your worth was never up for debate. See you at the Federal Judicial Conference next month." These messages carried weight because they came from people who understood the significance of federal judicial appointments, who knew the depth of preparation required for the cases I handled, who respected the intellectual rigor demanded by constitutional law and criminal justice. Their recognition had never wavered, because it was based on professional competence, rather than family dynamics. As the plane descended toward Reagan National Airport, I reviewed the case files I'd brought with me, preparing for Monday's hearings that would determine the fate of several criminal defendants. The cascade Castellano organized crime case required final jury instructions, a complex document that would guide 12 citizens through weeks of testimony about racketeering, money laundering, and conspiracy charges. The Henderson drug trafficking appeal needed careful attention to Fourth Amendment issues that could set precedent for future search and seizure cases. This was work that mattered in concrete, measurable ways. The defendants I convicted would no longer be able to harm innocent people. The legal precedents established in my courtroom would guide other judges facing similar constitutional questions. The sentences I imposed would either protect society from dangerous criminals or ensure that justice remained proportional to the crimes committed. My stepfamily's sudden awareness of my professional identity changed none of that fundamental importance. Whether Linda understood my career or not, whether Kevin and Ryan could finally recognize my achievements or not, the work itself remained significant and necessary. The taxi ride through Washington's familiar streets felt like a return to reality, after 3 days in an alternate universe, where family relationships operated according to different rules than professional ones. Here, competence was recognized immediately, respect was earned through consistent performance, and nobody had to discover your worth through FBI agents or Supreme Court communications. My Georgetown townhouse welcomed me with the quiet comfort of spaces designed for solitary reflection and intellectual work. Law books lined the walls, case files occupied every horizontal surface, and the only family photos visible were the ones featuring Dad and me at various professional milestones. This was a home built for a federal judge, uncluttered by the emotional complexity of step-family dynamics. I spent Sunday evening preparing for the week ahead, reviewing briefs and scheduling conferences with attorneys who needed guidance on procedural questions. The Supreme Court had confirmed Tuesday's preliminary discussion about the Morrison case, which meant I'd spend Monday evening preparing talking points about cryptocurrency regulations and offshore banking laws. Around 9 p.m., as I was finalizing notes for the Castellano jury instructions, my phone rang with a call from Jessica Park, the lead prosecutor on the case. Her voice carried the controlled excitement of someone who'd spent months building an airtight criminal case. "Judge Mitchell, I wanted to brief you on this weekend's developments before tomorrow's hearing. We arrested the 2 additional suspects I mentioned, and both are already cooperating with our investigation. The evidence they're providing should eliminate any possible defense arguments about prosecutorial overreach." "Excellent work, Miss Park. Have you shared this information with defense counsel through proper discovery channels?" "Yes, Your Honor. All materials were provided to the defense team within the required time frames. They've requested another continuance, claiming they need additional time to review the new evidence." I almost smiled at the predictability of defense tactics in complex criminal cases. When the evidence was overwhelming, attorneys typically resorted to procedural delays, hoping that time would create opportunities for plea negotiations or prosecutorial errors.
Continuance request is denied, I said firmly. The defense has had months to prepare their case, and the new evidence merely corroborates what we already knew about the defendant's criminal enterprise. We'll proceed with closing arguments as scheduled. After ending the call with Miss Park, I returned to my case preparation with the satisfaction that comes from meaningful work approaching successful completion. The Castellano prosecution represented 2 years of careful legal work, from the initial warrant applications through the complex evidentiary hearings that had established the foundation for trial. When the jury returned their inevitable guilty verdict, a dangerous criminal organization would be dismantled and their victims would have justice. This was why I'd become a federal judge, not for family recognition or social status, but for the opportunity to protect society from predators who used legitimate businesses as cover for devastating criminal enterprises. Every case I handled correctly meant fewer victims, safer communities, and stronger rule of law. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number, but when I opened it, I recognized the sender immediately. It was from Thomas Chen, my law school roommate who'd become a prominent defense attorney in San Francisco. Thomas had an uncanny ability to hear about legal developments across the country, and apparently my weekend family drama had reached even the California legal community. "Danny, heard through the grapevine about your family's interesting discovery process. Reminds me of that evidence class where Professor Williams kept saying ignorance of the facts doesn't change the facts. Hope you reminded them that judicial appointments aren't participation trophies." Thomas's message made me laugh out loud, something I hadn't done since before Dad's funeral. His reference to our shared law school experiences reminded me of the long journey from that first-year evidence class to my current position on the federal bench. Every step of that journey had been earned through academic excellence, professional competence, and intellectual rigor qualities that had nothing to do with family dynamics or personal recognition. I typed back quickly, Thomas, the facts were always the same. Some people just took longer to acknowledge them. See you at the Bar Association conference next month. Monday morning arrived with the crisp efficiency that characterized my professional life. Court convened at 9 a.m. sharp, with the Castellano case taking precedence on a docket filled with significant criminal matters. As I took my position behind the bench, looking out at the packed courtroom filled with prosecutors, defense attorneys, FBI agents, and family members of both victims and defendants, I felt the familiar weight of judicial responsibility settling around me like a comfortable robe. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I began, my voice carrying the authority that came from years of presiding over complex criminal cases. You have heard weeks of testimony regarding the charges against Dr. Vincent Castellano and his alleged co-conspirators. Today you will hear closing arguments from both the prosecution and defense, after which you will begin your deliberations. The next 4 hours unfolded with the precise choreography of federal criminal procedure. Jessica Park delivered a masterful closing argument, methodically walking the jury through mountains of evidence that demonstrated how Dr. Castellano had used his medical practice as a front for prescription drug trafficking. Wiretap recordings revealed conversations about drug quantities and distribution networks. Financial records showed millions of dollars flowing through shell companies designed to launder criminal proceeds. Cooperating witnesses testified about the devastating impact of illegally distributed opioids on communities across 3 states. The defense attorney, a seasoned criminal lawyer named Marcus Thompson, made a valiant but ultimately futile attempt to create reasonable doubt. He questioned the reliability of cooperating witnesses, suggested alternative explanations for financial transactions, and argued that Dr. Castellano had been a legitimate physician who'd been manipulated by criminal associates. But the evidence was overwhelming, and both sides knew it. Dr. Castellano had been recorded on federal wiretaps discussing drug quantities, distribution territories, and methods for avoiding law enforcement detection. His own medical records showed prescriptions written for patients he'd never examined, medications dispensed in quantities that exceeded any legitimate medical purpose. After both sides completed their presentations, I delivered jury instructions that had taken weeks to prepare, a complex legal document that explained federal racketeering laws, conspiracy statutes, and the burden of proof required for criminal conviction. The jury retired for deliberations at 3 p.m., and I returned to my chambers to handle other pressing matters, while they considered Dr. Castellano's fate. My judicial assistant had scheduled the preliminary conference call with the Supreme Court for 4 p.m., giving me an hour to review my notes about the Morrison financial crimes case that was likely to reach the High Court's docket next term. The case involved novel questions about cryptocurrency regulations and international banking laws, complex constitutional issues that would require careful analysis of Fourth Amendment protections in digital contexts. At exactly 4 p.m., my secure phone rang with a call from Justice Williams' chambers. The next 45 minutes involved detailed discussions about legal precedents, constitutional principles, and the potential implications of various judicial approaches to emerging financial technologies. The justice asked penetrating questions about my reasoning in the original Morrison decision, particularly my analysis of privacy rights in cryptocurrency transactions. Judge Mitchell, Justice Williams said as the conference call concluded, "Your written opinion in Morrison demonstrated exactly the kind of constitutional analysis we need as these technology cases reach our level. I anticipate we'll be requesting your input again as this case moves through our review process." The Supreme Court's recognition carried weight that family approval never could. Justice Williams was asking for my constitutional analysis because she respected my legal reasoning, not because she'd discovered my identity through external circumstances. This was professional recognition at the highest possible level, earned through years of careful judicial work and intellectual rigor. As I was organizing my notes from the Supreme Court conference, my judicial assistant knocked on my chamber's door with news that would bring the day full circle. "Judge Mitchell, the jury in Castellano has reached a verdict. They're ready to return to the courtroom." I straightened my robes and walked back into the courtroom, where the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Castellano sat beside his defense attorney, his medical license and criminal enterprise about to be adjudicated by 12 citizens who'd carefully considered weeks of evidence. The victims' families filled the gallery, hoping for justice after years of watching their communities devastated by illegally distributed opioids. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," I said as they filed back into the jury box, "have you reached a verdict in the case of United States v. Castellano?" The jury foreman, a retired teacher who'd taken detailed notes throughout the trial, stood with the gravity appropriate to the moment. "We have, Your Honor. On the charge of conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, how do you find?" "Guilty, Your Honor." "On the charge of operating a continuing criminal enterprise?" "Guilty, Your Honor." "On the charges of money laundering through interstate commerce?" "Guilty on all counts, Your Honor." Dr. Castellano's shoulders sagged as the weight of his conviction settled around him. His criminal enterprise was finished, his medical license would be revoked, and he would spend the rest of his life in federal prison. The communities he'd harmed would be safer, and his victims' families would have the justice they'd sought for years. This was why I'd become a federal judge. Not for recognition from family members who'd finally discovered my professional identity, but for moments like this when justice was served, and society was protected from predators who exploited positions of trust for criminal gain. As the courtroom emptied and Dr. Castellano was led away in handcuffs, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from meaningful work completed successfully. The case had been handled properly, constitutional rights had been protected, and a dangerous criminal had been held accountable for his actions. Later that evening, as I was reviewing files for Tuesday's docket, my phone buzzed with a text message from Kevin. It was the first communication I'd received from my stepfamily since leaving Portland 3 days earlier. "Danny, I know you're probably busy with important cases, but I wanted you to know that we're all processing what happened this weekend. I've been reading about your work, and I'm starting to understand what Dad meant when he used to talk about being proud of you. I'm sorry it took us so long to pay attention." I read the message twice before setting my phone aside without responding. Kevin's apology was more thoughtful than his previous attempts, and his acknowledgement of Dad's pride carried emotional weight. But recognition that came only after external validation felt hollow compared to the professional respect I'd earned through competence and consistency. My worth as a federal judge had never depended on my stepfamily's ability to understand my career. The Supreme Court valued my constitutional analysis, prosecutors trusted my legal reasoning, and defense attorneys respected my commitment to due process. That professional recognition was built on substance rather than discovery, competence rather than revelation. Around 10 p.m., as I was preparing for bed, my phone rang with a call from Dr. Michael Barnes in Portland. His voice carried the warmth of someone who'd witnessed the weekend's family drama with both sadness and satisfaction. "Danny, I wanted to check on you after everything that happened. How are you processing the aftermath of your family's sudden education about your career?" "Dr. Barnes, I'm fine. Honestly, their recognition doesn't change anything fundamental about my work or my life. I built my career independently of their approval, and it continues independently of their sudden awareness." "Your father would be proud of that response," Dr. Barnes said gently. "He used to worry that their dismissal hurt you more than you let on. I think he'd be relieved to know that you never needed their validation to succeed." "Dad's pride was enough," I replied. He understood what I was accomplishing, even when he couldn't make it visible in his own home. That recognition mattered because it came from love and understanding rather than obligation or social pressure. After we ended the call, I found myself thinking about the different types of recognition that had shaped my life. Dad's quiet pride had sustained me through law school and the early years of my career. Patricia Hartwell's mentorship had guided me through the federal appointment process. My judicial colleagues' respect had been earned through consistent performance and intellectual honesty. My stepfamily's belated recognition felt different, opportunistic rather than authentic, based on external validation rather than genuine understanding. They'd discovered my professional identity through an FBI agent's formal address, not through years of paying attention to my career development or celebrating my achievements. The contrast highlighted something important about the nature of meaningful relationships. Recognition that had to be forced through external circumstances lacked the substance of recognition that grew from consistent attention and genuine interest. Love that had to be convinced of worthiness was fundamentally different from love that recognized worth from the beginning.
As I turned off the lights in my Georgetown townhouse, I felt grateful for the clarity that the weekend had provided. My step-family finally knew who I was professionally, but I'd been that person all along. Their awareness didn't make me more important, and their previous ignorance hadn't made me less significant. I was Judge Daniel Mitchell, United States Federal Court, and that identity was secure regardless of who chose to acknowledge it. The work would continue, justice would be served, and my worth would remain exactly what it had always been: substantial, earned, and independent of family approval. The next morning would bring new cases, new challenges, and new opportunities to protect society through careful application of constitutional law and criminal justice principles. That work had never required my step-family's recognition, and it never would. Some truths exist independently of other people's ability to see them. Some achievements stand on their own merit, regardless of who chooses to celebrate them. And some recognition, when it finally comes, reveals more about the people giving it than the person receiving it. In the end, I'd learned that the most meaningful recognition comes from those who see your worth from the beginning, not from those who need external validation to open their eyes. Dad had seen it, my judicial colleagues had seen it, and that had always been enough. The rest was just family drama, interesting for a weekend, but irrelevant to the important work of building a meaningful life and career. Justice didn't care about family dynamics, constitutional law didn't require personal validation, and federal criminal cases were decided on evidence rather than recognition. I'd built my life on those principles, and they'd served me well. No family revelation, no matter how dramatic or belated, could change that fundamental foundation. Some people spend their lives waiting to be seen. Others build lives worth seeing, and let recognition follow naturally. I'd chosen the second path years ago, and nothing that happened at Dad's wake had changed that choice. The work would continue, and that was enough. 3 months after Dad's funeral, I received an unexpected phone call on a quiet Thursday afternoon in my federal chambers. The caller ID showed a Portland number I didn't recognize, but something compelled me to answer despite my usual policy of screening unknown calls during court hours. Judge Mitchell. The voice was unfamiliar, elderly with the careful diction of someone accustomed to formal conversation. This is Eleanor Hartfield from the Portland Medical Foundation. I hope I'm not interrupting important court business. Not at all, Mrs. Hartfield. How can I help you? Judge Mitchell, I'm calling regarding your late father, Dr. Robert Mitchell. The foundation is planning our annual humanitarian award ceremony, and we'd like to dedicate this year's program to your father's memory. We were hoping you might consider delivering the keynote address about his legacy of service. I set down the brief I'd been reviewing, giving Mrs. Hartfield my full attention. I'm honored by the invitation, but I should mention that I live and work in Washington, D.C. now. My connections to the Portland medical community are limited. Oh, Judge Mitchell, that's exactly why we want you to speak. Your father talked about you constantly at our board meetings. He was so proud of your work in federal criminal justice, always connecting your commitment to protecting society with his own mission of healing children. He used to say that you both chose careers dedicated to making the world safer, just through different methods. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Mrs. Hartfield sharing stories about Dad's volunteer work that I'd never heard before. Apparently, he'd spent every Saturday morning for 15 years providing free medical screenings at homeless shelters, had funded a scholarship program for underprivileged students pursuing medical careers, and had quietly paid for expensive treatments for families who couldn't afford them. Mrs. Hartfield, I said as our conversation wound down, I'd be honored to speak at the ceremony. When is it scheduled? December 15th, Judge Mitchell. It's our biggest fundraising event of the year, usually attended by about 500 people from the medical community and their families. Your stepmother Linda has been very helpful with the planning, and she specifically requested that we invite you to participate. After ending the call, I sat in my chambers thinking about Linda's involvement in honoring Dad's memory. Since that difficult weekend in October, our communication had been limited to occasional text messages, polite exchanges about practical matters related to Dad's estate, but nothing approaching the deeper conversation she'd requested in her emotional voicemail. The truth was, I'd been avoiding that conversation deliberately. Her late-night discovery of Dad's pride in my achievements had felt too little, too late, colored by the convenience of timing rather than genuine recognition. But her involvement in this memorial ceremony suggested something different, a sustained effort to honor Dad's values, rather than a momentary crisis of conscience. Over the next several weeks, I found myself researching Dad's charitable work, discovering a pattern of quiet generosity that had lasted decades. Hospital records showed thousands of hours of volunteer service. Financial documents revealed anonymous donations to medical research and patient assistance programs. Letters from grateful families painted a picture of a man who'd viewed medicine as a calling rather than just a profession. The more I learned, the more I understood why Dad had been frustrated by my step-family's inability to recognize achievement that didn't come with obvious external rewards. His own greatest accomplishments had been acts of service that generated no publicity, no social recognition, no advancement in status or wealth. He'd simply helped people, because helping people was the right thing to do. In early December, as I was finalizing my speech for the Medical Foundation ceremony, I received another unexpected communication from Portland. This time it was a handwritten letter from Kevin, his corporate lawyer's precision evident in every carefully formed sentence. "Danny," the letter began, "I've been thinking about our family dynamics for months now, trying to understand how we failed to see something so obvious for so long. I keep coming back to the same uncomfortable conclusion. We saw exactly what we wanted to see, and we ignored everything that challenged our preconceptions." The letter continued for 3 pages, detailing Kevin's growing awareness of his own role in the family's systematic dismissal of my achievements. He described conversations with his law firm colleagues, who'd heard of my work, meetings with federal prosecutors, who spoke of my courtroom with respect, and his dawning realization that he'd been professionally adjacent to my reputation for years without making the connection. "I think the problem," Kevin wrote in his conclusion, "was that we expected success to look like our own success, loud, visible, socially rewarding. We didn't understand that your kind of achievement operates in different circles, serves different purposes, and measures success by different standards. That ignorance was our failing, not yours." The letter surprised me with its depth of self-reflection and genuine accountability. Kevin wasn't asking for forgiveness or requesting a relationship repair. He was simply acknowledging reality and taking responsibility for his role in creating years of family dysfunction. A week later, Ryan sent a similar communication, though his approach was characteristically more direct and less philosophical. "Danny, I screwed up for 20 years by not paying attention to who you actually are, versus who I assumed you were. I can't fix that, but I can stop making the same mistake going forward. If you're ever willing to have a real conversation about your work, I promise to actually listen this time." These communications felt different from the panicked apologies and research-driven recognition that had immediately followed the funeral wake. They suggested sustained reflection rather than momentary crisis, genuine understanding rather than shock discovery. But the most significant letter came from Linda, arriving just 2 days before I was scheduled to fly to Portland for the Medical Foundation ceremony. Her handwriting was shaky, emotional unlike the controlled precision I'd associated with her correspondence. "Danny," she wrote, "I've spent 3 months reading everything your father kept about your career. Not just the newspaper articles and legal journal mentions, but his personal notes about conversations with you, his reflections on your cases, his pride in your judicial philosophy. I'm beginning to understand that I didn't just miss your achievements, I missed your relationship with your father." The letter revealed details I'd never known about Dad's private thoughts. Apparently he'd kept a journal where he regularly wrote about his pride in my career, his frustration with Linda and the boys' inability to appreciate my accomplishments, and his regret about not advocating more forcefully for recognition within the family. He wrote about feeling caught between his love for you and his desire to maintain peace in our household, Linda continued. He worried that pushing too hard for your recognition would create conflict, but he also worried that his silence was enabling our dismissal of your achievements. He died carrying that tension, and I'm only now understanding the cost of my willful blindness. The letter concluded with something I hadn't expected, not another request for forgiveness or family reconciliation, but a commitment to honoring Dad's memory by finally seeing me clearly, regardless of whether our relationship could be repaired. "I don't know if 20 years of damage can be undone," Linda wrote in her final paragraph, "but I can at least stop causing new damage. I can acknowledge who you are, celebrate what you've accomplished, and honor the pride your father felt in the man you became. That recognition should have come decades ago, but it's what I can offer now." The flight to Portland for the Medical Foundation ceremony felt like a return to a different city than the one I'd left 3 months earlier. Winter rain painted the familiar streets in shades of gray and silver, but the emotional landscape felt fundamentally altered by months of reflection and communication. The ceremony was held at the Portland Art Museum, its galleries transformed into an elegant venue for the medical community's annual celebration of humanitarian service. As I arrived and made my way through the cocktail reception, I was struck by how many people approached me with stories about Dad's impact on their lives or their children's health. Dr. Sarah Chen, a pediatric oncologist at the Children's Hospital, shared memories of Dad's volunteer work with young cancer patients. "Your father had a gift for making sick children laugh," she said. "He'd spend hours with families during the worst moments of their lives, offering not just medical expertise but genuine comfort and hope." Nurse Patricia Rodriguez described Dad's insistence on providing follow-up care for patients whose families couldn't afford regular checkups. Mitchell would show up at homeless shelters and community centers on his own time, bringing medical supplies he'd purchased himself, making sure children had access to the care they needed. These stories painted a picture of the man I'd known privately, but whose public service had been largely invisible to his own family. Dad had lived his values quietly, serving others without seeking recognition or reward, motivated by the same sense of justice and protection that had drawn me to federal criminal law. Linda appeared beside me as I was speaking with a group of medical residents who'd known Dad during their training. Her appearance was more subdued than I'd ever seen, less polished, more genuine, as if she'd stopped performing the role of perfect widow and started simply being a woman who missed her husband. "Danny," she said quietly, "could I speak with you privately for a moment? There's something I want to show you." She led me to a quiet corner of the gallery where a memorial display had been arranged with photos and memorabilia from Dad's career. But tucked into one corner was something I hadn't expected, a small section dedicated to my own achievements, featuring the newspaper clippings and professional recognitions that Dad had kept but never displayed prominently. "I asked Mrs. Hartfield if we could include this," Linda said, her voice uncertain. "I thought people should see the full scope of your father's pride, including his pride in you. I should have done this years ago, when he was alive to enjoy it." The display was simple but comprehensive: photographs from my swearing-in ceremony, articles about significant cases I'd presided over, and even a copy of the letter from the Supreme Court requesting my input on constitutional questions. But what moved me most was a handwritten note in Dad's familiar script, apparently intended for his own reference. "Danny represents everything I hope to instill in my children: a commitment to justice, service to others, and the courage to stand up for what's right." He wrote that after your confirmation hearing, Linda said, following my gaze to Dad's note. "He wanted to frame it and put it on his office wall, but I discouraged him, saying it might seem like bragging. I was wrong about that, like I was wrong about so many things." As the evening progressed, and the formal ceremony began, I found myself observing my step-family with new understanding. Kevin and Ryan had both attended, wearing suits that suggested they'd taken the event seriously rather than treating it as a social obligation. During my keynote address about Dad's legacy of service, I noticed them listening intently, nodding at references to values and principles they'd apparently never associated with my own career choices. My speech focused on the connection between Dad's medical mission and my judicial work, two different approaches to the same fundamental goal of protecting vulnerable people from harm. Robert Mitchell understood that healing extends beyond individual patients to entire communities, I said, addressing the audience of medical professionals and community leaders. His work in free clinics and homeless shelters wasn't separate from his private practice, it was the fullest expression of his commitment to medical ethics and human dignity. I concluded by drawing parallels to the criminal justice system. In my work as a federal judge, I've learned that protecting society requires the same combination of expertise, compassion, and unwavering principles that characterized my father's approach to medicine. Whether we're healing bodies or upholding laws, our highest calling is service to others. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with several attendees commenting afterward that they'd never understood the connection between medical service and judicial service until hearing my remarks. Dr. Michael Barnes, who'd been instrumental in helping me understand Dad's private pride, approached me with tears in his eyes. "Danny, your father would have been so proud to hear you connect his work with your own. He always said that
You'd both chosen careers in protection, him protecting children's health, you protecting society's safety. Tonight, everyone in this room finally understood what he meant." As the evening wound down and guests began departing, Linda approached me one final time. Her demeanor was different than I'd ever seen. Vulnerable without being manipulative, sad without being dramatic. "Danny, I know this doesn't erase 20 years of mistakes, but I want you to know that tonight felt like the first time I truly honored your father's memory. Seeing his pride in you displayed publicly, Hearing you speak about the values you shared, it's what he always wanted for our family. Linda, I replied carefully, I appreciate the effort you've made to organize this memorial, and I'm grateful that Dad's service is being recognized properly. But I need you to understand that this can't be the beginning of a relationship built on guilt or obligation. I know, she said simply. I'm not asking for forgiveness or family reconciliation, I'm just trying to stop making the same mistakes going forward. Your father loved you deeply, and he was proud of what you accomplished. The least I can do is acknowledge that truth publicly, even if our personal relationship can't be repaired. Her honesty was unexpected and strangely moving. For the first time in 20 years, Linda was speaking to me without an agenda, without attempting to manage perception or maintain social harmony. She was simply stating facts and accepting responsibility for her failures. The flight back to Washington the next morning felt peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced since Dad's death. The medical foundation ceremony had provided closure not just for Dad's memory, but for my own understanding of family dynamics and personal worth. My step-family finally understood who I was professionally, but more importantly, they understood who Dad had been privately, a man whose greatest pride came from his children's service to others. Back in my federal chambers, surrounded by case files and constitutional law texts, I reflected on how the evening had changed my perspective on recognition and family relationships. Linda's acknowledgement of her mistakes hadn't repaired our relationship, but it had freed me from the burden of hoping for recognition that might never come authentically. The Supreme Court conference call scheduled for that afternoon would focus on emerging constitutional questions about digital privacy and federal law enforcement, work that mattered regardless of whether my step-family understood its significance. The criminal defendants appearing before my bench next week would receive fair hearings based on evidence and law, not family dynamics or personal recognition. My worth as a federal judge had never depended on family approval, and the weekend in Portland had confirmed that truth in ways I hadn't expected. Dad's pride had been enough during his lifetime, and my own satisfaction with meaningful work was enough going forward. The phone rang with a call from Judge Patricia Hartwell, my mentor who'd guided me through the federal appointment process years earlier. Danny, I heard through the grapevine about your speech in Portland. Word is that you brilliantly connected medical service with judicial service, and that your family finally understood what they'd been missing. Patricia, they understand now, but the recognition feels different when it comes through external validation rather than genuine attention over time. It doesn't change anything fundamental about my work or my life. That's exactly the right attitude, Patricia replied. Some recognition is worth having, and some recognition reveals more about the people giving it than the person receiving it. The work speaks for itself, Danny. Everything else is just background noise. As I prepared for the afternoon's Supreme Court conference, I felt grateful for the clarity that recent months had provided. My step-family's belated recognition hadn't diminished me, and their years of dismissal hadn't defined me. The work itself, protecting constitutional rights, ensuring fair trials, upholding the rule of law, remained as important and meaningful as ever. That evening, as I reviewed case files in my Georgetown townhouse, I received one final message from Portland. It was from Kevin, brief but significant. Danny, after hearing you speak last night, I finally understand what Dad meant when he used to talk about being proud of his children. Thank you for showing us what service actually looks like. I saved the message but didn't respond immediately. Some conversations had run their course, and some understanding came too late to rebuild relationships, but not too late to provide peace. My step-family finally knew who I was, but I'd been that person all along. The next morning would bring new cases, new constitutional questions, new opportunities to serve justice through careful application of federal law. That work had never required family recognition, and it never would. Some truths exist independently of other people's ability to see them. Some achievements stand on their own merit, regardless of who chooses to celebrate them. And some peace comes not from being seen, but from building a life worth seeing regardless of who's watching. In the end, Dad had seen what mattered. My judicial colleagues respected what counted, and that had always been enough. Everything else was just family drama, interesting for a season, but irrelevant to the important work of building a meaningful career in service to justice. The recognition I'd waited for as a child had finally come, but it arrived too late to matter in the ways I'd once imagined. The recognition that actually mattered, from colleagues, from the Supreme Court, from the communities I served through my judicial work, had been there all along. That was the real lesson of Dad's memorial service. Some people spend their lives waiting to be seen by those closest to them. Others build lives worth seeing and let recognition follow naturally from those who understand the value of the work itself. I'd chosen the second path years ago, and nothing that happened in Portland had changed that fundamental choice. The work would continue, justice would be served, and my worth would remain exactly what it had always been: substantial, earned, and independent of family dynamics. 5 years later, I stood before the United States Senate Judiciary Committee, raising my right hand to take the oath that would confirm my appointment to the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. The chamber was filled with legal colleagues, federal prosecutors, and Supreme Court justices who had recommended me for this historic promotion. At 39, I was about to become the youngest appellate judge in the circuit's history, with jurisdiction over federal cases across 9 western states. As I spoke the words that would bind me to uphold the Constitution and administer justice without favor or prejudice, my eyes swept across the gallery, where a small section had been reserved for family members. Michael Barnes sat in the front row, having flown from Portland to witness what he called Robert's greatest pride finally receiving its proper recognition. Beside him sat Judge Patricia Hartwell, my mentor whose guidance had shaped my judicial philosophy for over a decade. And in the third row, somewhat to my surprise, sat Linda, Kevin, and Ryan. They had traveled from Portland without invitation or announcement, their presence both unexpected and strangely appropriate for a moment that represented the culmination of everything Dad had hoped I might achieve in public service. The confirmation hearing that morning had been a master class in constitutional law and judicial philosophy. Senator Williams from Oregon had questioned me extensively about my approach to criminal justice reform, particularly my work on cases involving organized crime and financial fraud. Senator Rodriguez from California had focused on my opinions regarding digital privacy rights and Fourth Amendment protections in the Internet age. Judge Mitchell, Senator Williams had said during the most challenging portion of the questioning, "Your record on the federal bench shows an unusual combination of tough criminal sentencing and strong constitutional protections for defendants. How do you reconcile these apparently contradictory approaches?" "Senator, there's no contradiction between protecting constitutional rights and holding criminals accountable for their actions. The Constitution requires that we follow due process in pursuing justice, not that we abandon justice in the name of procedure. My judicial philosophy has always been that the strongest criminal convictions come from the most rigorous adherence to constitutional principles." Senator Rodriguez had pressed me on more contemporary issues. Judge Mitchell, as federal courts grapple with emerging technologies, how do you approach constitutional questions that the framers couldn't have anticipated? "Senator, the framers gave us principles rather than specific applications. The Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches doesn't mention wiretaps, email surveillance, or cryptocurrency tracking because those technologies didn't exist in 1791. But the underlying principle, that citizens have a reasonable expectation of privacy, that government must respect through proper warrant procedures, applies regardless of the specific technology involved." The hearing had lasted 4 hours, with senators from both parties testing my knowledge of constitutional law, federal procedure, and judicial ethics. But the most meaningful moment had come when Senator Thompson from Washington State had asked about my motivation for pursuing federal judicial service. "Judge Mitchell, you've spent 8 years on the district court handling some of the most complex criminal cases in federal jurisdiction. You could have pursued private practice, corporate law, or any number of more lucrative career paths. What drives your commitment to public service?" I had paused before answering, thinking about Dad's example and the values that had shaped my understanding of meaningful work. "Senator, my father was a pediatrician who spent 40 years healing children and serving his community. He taught me that the highest calling in any profession is using your skills to protect those who can't protect themselves. Federal judges have the privilege of upholding constitutional principles that safeguard individual rights while protecting society from those who would do harm. There's no more important work in our legal system." The confirmation vote had been unanimous, a rare occurrence in an era of partisan judicial politics, but a reflection of the professional reputation I'd built through 8 years of careful legal reasoning and consistent constitutional interpretation. Now, as the ceremony concluded, and I received congratulations from colleagues and legal scholars, I found myself approached by Linda, who had waited patiently as more prominent well-wishers offered their praise and predictions about my appellate career. Danny, she said quietly, her voice carrying none of the nervous energy I'd associated with our previous interactions. I wanted to congratulate you on this appointment. Your father would have been overwhelmed with pride. Thank you, Linda. I appreciate you making the trip to Washington for the ceremony. Actually, she continued, I have something I've been wanting to give you for years, but I never felt like the timing was right. She reached into her purse and withdrew a small wooden box, worn smooth by years of handling. This was your father's. He kept it on his desk at the medical office, and after he died, I found it filled with mementos from your career. I think he would have wanted you to have it back. I opened the box carefully, finding it filled with items I remembered from childhood visits to Dad's office, a small eagle pin from my high school debate team, a graduation tassel from law school, and tucked underneath everything else, a newspaper clipping from my first major federal case. But what moved me most was a handwritten note in Dad's familiar script. For Danny, who chose justice over profit and service over recognition. The son who made his father's values real in the world. He wrote that the day you were confirmed for the district court. Linda said, watching my reaction to the note. He wanted to give you this box then, but he was worried you might think it was too sentimental. He was always afraid of embarrassing you with how proud he was. Kevin and Ryan joined us, both of them looking uncomfortable, but determined to be present for what was clearly an important family moment. Kevin spoke first, his corporate lawyer's precision replaced by something more genuine. Danny, I know we have a complicated history, but I wanted you to know that I've been following your appellate nomination process in the legal journals. The commentary about your constitutional analysis has been remarkable. Professors at my old law school are using your district court opinions as teaching examples. Ryan, characteristically more direct, simply said, I finally understand what Dad meant when he used to talk about being proud of his children. Watching you answer those senators' questions today, seeing how they respected your knowledge, I get it now. Their words carried weight because they came without expectation of response or relationship repair. These weren't apologies seeking forgiveness, but acknowledgments of reality that had taken years to reach the surface. Dr. Michael Barnes approached our small family group, his medical colleague's perspective, adding context to the moment. Danny, your father used to say that you'd inherited his commitment to healing, just through different methods. After watching today's confirmation hearing, I finally understand what he meant. Constitutional law is a form of civic medicine, diagnosing problems in our legal system, and prescribing remedies that protect democratic principles. The analogy resonated deeply, connecting my judicial work with Dad's medical mission in ways I'd never fully articulated. Both careers involved careful diagnosis of complex problems, application of learned principles to unique situations, and commitment to outcomes that serve the broader community, rather than individual interests. As the afternoon reception continued, I found myself in conversation with Justice Williams, who had traveled from the Supreme Court to witness my appellate confirmation. Her presence was both an honor and a professional recognition that carried implications beyond this single ceremony. Judge Mitchell, Justice Williams said, the court has been watching your district court work with considerable interest. Your opinions on digital privacy rights and federal law enforcement powers have been cited in several of our recent decisions. I suspect we'll be seeing more of your legal reasoning as cases move up through the appellate system. Justice Williams, I'm honored that the court has found my analysis useful. Constitutional law in the digital age requires careful balance between law enforcement needs and privacy protections. I've tried to apply established Fourth Amendment principles to emerging technologies without losing sight of the framers' underlying intent. That's exactly the kind of constitutional thinking we need as these cases reach our level, Justice Williams replied. The law must evolve with technology while preserving fundamental principles. Your appellate decisions will likely provide important guidance for lower courts, grappling with similar issues. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering everything from cryptocurrency regulations to artificial intelligence surveillance programs. Justice Williams was essentially offering a preview of the constitutional questions that would define the next decade of federal jurisprudence, and my appellate court would be positioned to shape those discussions through careful legal reasoning and precedent-setting decisions. Later that evening, as the formal reception concluded and guests began departing, I found myself walking through the Capitol grounds with Linda, Kevin, and Ryan. The conversation was unlike any we'd had in 20 years, focused on substance rather than social obligations, characterized by genuine curiosity rather than polite disinterest.
Danny, Kevin said, as we paused near the Supreme Court building. I have to ask, when you were growing up, did you always know you wanted to be a federal judge? Was this part of some long-term plan? Not specifically, I replied, thinking about the childhood experiences that had shaped my understanding of justice and public service. But I always knew I wanted work that mattered, work that protected people who couldn't protect themselves. Dad's example showed me what service looked like in medicine. I found my version of that service in constitutional law. Ryan, with his finance background, approached the question differently. What I don't understand is how you stayed motivated through all those years of school and early career development without the kind of immediate rewards that most people expect. Federal judges don't get rich, don't get famous, don't get the social recognition that comes with other prestigious careers. Ryan, the recognition that matters comes from the work itself. When you sentence an organized crime leader to life in prison, you know you've protected countless potential victims. When you uphold constitutional protections for defendants, you've strengthened the rule of law for everyone. When the Supreme Court cites your legal reasoning, you've contributed to the development of American jurisprudence. That's more meaningful than any amount of money or social status. Linda had been quiet during this exchange, but as we reached the point where our paths would diverge, them returning to their hotel, me to my Georgetown townhouse, she spoke with an honesty that surprised me. Danny, I need to say something I should have said years ago. Your father tried repeatedly to help us understand what you were accomplishing, but we were too focused on our own definitions of success to listen. I think we were intimidated by achievements we couldn't measure in ways we understood. It was easier to dismiss what we didn't comprehend than to admit our ignorance. She paused, looking up at the Supreme Court building, illuminated against the dark sky. Today, watching you answer those senators' questions, seeing how legal scholars respect your work, I finally understand what your father saw from the beginning. You've dedicated your life to something larger than personal advancement, and that's a rare and valuable thing.
Whoa!
The admission carried weight because it came without expectation of forgiveness or relationship repair. Linda was simply acknowledging reality, taking responsibility for years of willful blindness, and expressing genuine respect for the path I'd chosen. As we parted that evening, I reflected on how dramatically the family dynamics had shifted over the 5 years since Dad's funeral. The revelation at the wake had forced immediate recognition of my professional identity, but true understanding had required years of sustained attention to my actual work, rather than just my job title. The drive through Washington's familiar streets felt different than usual, charged with the significance of the day's events and the weight of new responsibilities. As an appellate judge, I would be reviewing decisions from dozens of district courts, shaping federal law across 9 states, and contributing to constitutional interpretation that would guide American jurisprudence for decades. My Georgetown townhouse welcomed me with the quiet comfort of a space designed for serious intellectual work. Law books lined every wall, case files occupied every horizontal surface, and the only decorations were photographs from significant moments in my judicial career, swearing-in ceremonies, Supreme Court conferences, and the occasional picture with Dad at professional milestones he'd made sure to attend. As I settled into my study to review materials for next week's appellate orientation, I found myself thinking about the journey from that first day of law school, when I dreamed of using legal education to serve justice, through the years of district court service, where I'd learned to balance constitutional principles with practical law enforcement needs, to this new chapter where my decisions would influence federal law across a multi-state region. The work had always been meaningful, but now it carried additional weight and responsibility. Appellate decisions created precedent that guided lower courts, shaped legal education, and influenced how constitutional principles were applied to emerging social and technological challenges. My phone buzzed with a text message from Judge Patricia Hartwell, who had returned to her chambers after the confirmation ceremony. Danny, today felt like watching a son receive the recognition his father always knew he deserved. Robert would have been bursting with pride. More importantly, the legal system gained exactly the kind of constitutional scholar it needs for the challenges ahead. Patricia's message captured something important about the day's significance. This wasn't just personal advancement or professional recognition, it was positioning to serve justice at a higher level, with greater responsibility for protecting constitutional principles and individual rights. Around midnight, as I was preparing for bed, I received one final message that brought the day full circle. It was from Dr. Michael Barnes, in Portland, sent with the subject line, "Your father's greatest achievement." Danny, the email read, I've been thinking about your confirmation ceremony all evening, remembering conversations I had with your father over the years about his hopes for your career. He used to say that his greatest pride wasn't just your professional success, but your commitment to using that success in service of others. Today I watched you take an oath to uphold justice and constitutional principles, and I realized that everything Robert hoped you might become has come to pass. You've honored his memory, not through family recognition or social advancement, but through dedication to the highest principles of public service. That's a legacy worthy of the man who raised you. The message reminded me of something fundamental about the path I'd chosen. Recognition from family members, while personally meaningful, was secondary to the work itself. Dad's pride had always been based on my commitment to service, rather than my accumulation of titles or status. The appellate appointment was significant not because it elevated my social position, but because it expanded my capacity to protect constitutional rights and serve justice. As I turned off the lights in my Georgetown study, surrounded by law books and case files that would guide tomorrow's judicial work, I felt grateful for the clarity that recent years had provided. My stepfamily's understanding of my career had evolved from willful ignorance to genuine respect, but their recognition hadn't changed the fundamental nature of the work or its importance to democratic society. The next morning would bring new responsibilities as an appellate judge, new constitutional questions that required careful analysis, new opportunities to shape federal law through reasoned legal opinion. That work had never depended on family approval, and it never would. But for the first time in 20 years, my family finally understood what Dad had always known, that some careers are measured not by personal advancement, but by service to principles larger than individual ambition. Some recognition comes too late to rebuild relationships, but not too late to provide peace and mutual understanding. The confirmation ceremony had marked not just a professional milestone, but the completion of a longer journey toward family truth and personal clarity. My worth as a federal judge had never required their validation, but their respect, finally offered authentically, rather than opportunistically, felt like a gift I could accept without compromising the independence I'd fought to maintain. In the end, justice had been served, not just in my courtroom, but in the family dynamics that had taken 2 decades to resolve. Some truths take time to surface, some recognition requires patience, and some relationships find their proper balance only after enough distance has been traveled to see clearly. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new constitutional challenges, new opportunities to protect the principles that make democratic society possible. The work itself remained as important and meaningful as ever, but now it proceeded with the peace that comes from being truly seen and understood by those who matter most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.